The Aleutian Islands, a 1,500-mile-long chain of volcanic peaks, stretches from mainland Alaska almost to Japan. They're bleak and barren, covered with tundra and volcanic ash. Hardly an ideal setting for a war, the Aleutian Islands were the scene of the only World War II battle fought on North American soil. Alaska was unprepared for war when a lonely Aleutian island called Umnak took on historic significance in September of 1941. Alaska's military leaders had repeatedly asked Washington for bases in the Aleutians, but their pleas were ignored. The Army's Alaska commander, General Simon B. Buckner, decided to bypass the Washington bureaucracy. Soon, crates from Saxon and Company to the Blair Fish Packing Company were unloaded on the island, ostensibly to build a fish cannery. In reality, there were no such companies, nor was there to be a fish cannery. It was an elaborate cover for the construction of a top-secret military airfield positioned to defend Dutch Harbor, roughly 40 miles away, from possible Japanese attack. For years, Chilkoot Barracks had been the only established Army facility in Alaska. The combat aircraft in all of Alaska consisted of obsolete B-18 bombers and P-36 fighters, totally inadequate for the job of patrolling the Aleutian Island chain. Dutch Harbor was in an ideal position to block potential attacks on the west coast. The Army had just set up Fort Mears, a supply depot at Dutch Harbor. Corps of Engineers Colonel Benjamin Talley went to Dutch Harbor that September of 1941 to find a location for an airbase. Otter Point on nearby Umnak Island seemed the only suitable site. Other than Navy bases at Kodiak and Sitka, there were no airfield facilities in the Aleutians. Even a new base being built at Cold Bay was over 200 miles away. In late January 1942, the 807th Engineer Battalion arrived at Umnak Island. Surveyors laid out a system of roads, runways, and revetments, protected as much as was possible from the legendary Aleutian weather. High winds, low clouds, and constant moisture was the norm. 10 sunny days a year was considered a blessing, and snow in the summer was not unheard of. Road graders fought the slick tundra surface, common to the Aleutian Islands. When wheels lost grip in the mud and the icy subsurface, earth scrapers were brought in to finish the job. These carved through the grassy surface to expose the layers of the soft volcanic ground beneath. Meanwhile, steam shovels dug into the nearby hillsides to scoop up gravel. Trucks, large and small, hauled load after load to the airfield, dumping tons of gravel to provide a reasonably solid base for the runways. It was literally a 24-hour-a-day operation. The runways took shape rapidly. Bulldozers pushed and shoved each load of gravel over the exposed permafrost. They made a level surface, but thanks to the Aleutian climate, the runways would be a mile-long muddy lake during the short summers, and in the Arctic winter, a long sheet of ice. For the engineers and the military planners, their problems were compounded by time. No one knew for sure if or when the Japanese might attack Alaska. From General Buckner's standpoint, an attack was inevitable, and Dutch Harbor the most likely target. Since time was considered critical, a concrete surface would simply take too long. Another way to provide a firm surface had to be found. Talley's engineers decided to gamble on a newly introduced and still experimental product, PSP, pierced steel planking, or more properly, Marsden matting. No one knew if it could provide a solid and stable runway surface on Alaska's tundra. Each piece was manhandled into position and securely fastened by hand to form a hard runway surface. This was the first use of PSP under war conditions. Within a year, different and far worse construction problems would face the engineers on the Aleutian islands of Adak and Amchitka. In less than 3 weeks, the secret base at Umnak was ready to receive its first aircraft, and the aircraft were about to experience the thrills of landing on PSP, placed atop very soft, sponge-like ground. First to land on the new base was an Army C-53, a military transport version of the DC-3 airliner. It brought a load of needed supplies and a VIP. General William Butler, commander of the newly formed 11th Air Force in Alaska, arrived to inspect the new base, now named Fort Glenn. After unloading, the flight crew quickly got a feel for operating on the PSP-covered tundra surface. Even the empty weight of the aircraft caused the wheels to press the PSP into the wet ground. Other problems with PSP included vulnerability to being ripped apart, leaving undetected sharp edges which could be quite hazardous to the tires on other aircraft. Wet or frozen PSP proved to be slippery, especially for maintenance and refueling vehicles and personnel. While it wasn't an ideal surface, especially in the Aleutians, there was a general agreement that takeoffs and landings were adequate with the PSP and impossible without it. The gamble on using PSP on Alaska's tundra had paid off. Soon, the promised newer aircraft began arriving in Alaska. They staged through 5 newly expanded airports in Canada. Their basic route through northern Canada followed what today is known as the ALCAN, or Alaska-Canada Highway. The flight to Alaska took 6 weeks. Many of the P-40 pilots had less than 8 hours of actual P-40 flying time before starting the long journey north. 8 P-40s crashed en route. Once the secret Otter Point base was fully operational, more aircraft arrived. The 343rd Fighter Group, with 2 P-40 fighter squadrons, the 11th and the 18th, and the 54th Fighter Squadron with P-38s, was established as part of the new 11th Air Force. 2 Canadian P-40 squadrons, number 111 and number 115, were attached. American heavy bombers joined the PBY patrol planes from Kodiak and Sitka. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning arrived in Alaska shortly after their P-40 contemporaries and were quickly deployed to the Aleutian Islands. Having 2 engines gave P-38 pilots a feeling of confidence during long overwater missions. The 38's wider tricycle landing gear generally made the PSP landings much easier to handle, but not always. Flying in the Aleutians was never easy, even under the best of conditions. Operational accidents were common, even on the few good weather days. Weather in the Aleutian Islands was some of the worst in the world. It was not uncommon for one aircraft to land under clear skies and the next, only minutes later, find the runway socked in by fog. Winds were tricky, prone to change direction or speed in the blink of an eye. It didn't take long for the Aleutian pilots to learn they fought 2 enemies, the Japanese and the Aleutian Willowas. The weather was the worst of the 2. Willowas included sudden and drastic changes in wind speed and direction, often bringing unforecast and unexpected fog, rain, snow, or all 3 together. One documented incident tells of a weather observation plane on the 1,200-mile round trip to Kiska. It took 2 hours to reach Kiska and 9 hours to return. The plane had barely enough fuel left to taxi off the runway. In spite of accidents and weather, operations went on. In the Aleutians, if you had a 100-foot ceiling, that was flying weather. The fighters flew constant patrols in search of the elusive Japanese. Air-to-air engagements were few and far between and relived in hot conversations back on base. Probably the best-known squadron in the Aleutian Campaign was Jack Chenault's 11th Fighter Squadron, with their Bengal Tiger-marked P-40s. Chenault, son of General Claire Chenault of Flying Tiger fame, had his squadron's aircraft carry the Tiger head markings in honor of the China-based Flying Tigers. With the normal low-cloud conditions, it wasn't unusual for pilots returning to base to be so close to the ocean that props kicked up spray behind them. The old rule of climbing above the clouds didn't work in the Aleutians. Radio beacons and navigational aids were non-existent. More than a few pilots from both sides tried to go above the weather and were never seen again. Aleutian weather was never predictable for either side, and it played no favorites. The anticipated Japanese attack came June 3, 1942. As General Buckner expected, the target was Dutch Harbor. Although Japan had plans to occupy Adak, Kiska, and Altu, the real purpose of their Aleutian operation was to draw the American Navy away from the primary Japanese objective, Midway Island. A multi-service communication setup at Dutch Harbor failed, and the waiting American pilots were never alerted for the first Japanese attack. Still unaware of the Umnak base, the second enemy attack did run into the full fury of American fighters. The appearance of the P-40s came as a complete surprise to the Japanese, who, expecting no opposition, quickly lost 2 of their number. Lieutenants Jacob Dixon and John Murphy of the 11th Fighter Squadron shared credit for the first P-40 kill of the Aleutian Campaign. Following their defeat at Midway, the Japanese in the Aleutians retreated and dropped their planned occupation of Adak. Ultimately, they occupied the extreme western Aleutian islands of Kiska and Altu, 600 and 800 miles west of Dutch Harbor. The Japanese now held American soil, a fact then kept secret from the American people. The American forces moved rapidly to build new bases between the Japanese-occupied islands and Dutch Harbor. The islands of Adak and then Amchitka became forward bases for continuing attacks on Kiska and Altu. Two months after the Dutch Harbor attack, the first ever combat action for the P-38 fighter planes took place in the Aleutian Islands. On August 4, 1942, Lieutenants Ken Ambrose and Stan Long each downed a Japanese Mavis flying boat. They are credited with the first P-38 kills of World War II. Navy PBYs and Martin B-26 bombers carried the bomb loads in the first days of the Aleutian Campaign. But soon both the B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers were operating from the Aleutian bases, later to be joined by the B-25 medium bombers. For the flyers, the return to base meant another landing on the PSP-covered sponge. No matter how proficient the pilot, the tundra under that Marsden matting could be counted on to hide a surprise for the unwary. Meanwhile, the objective remained: kick the Japanese out of Kiska and Altu and off the North American continent. Heavy bombers, the 21st Bomb Squadron's B-24s and the 36th Squadron's B-17s, continued to pound the Japanese-held islands. During the first months of the Aleutian War, more than 125,000 pounds of bombs were delivered to the Japanese on Kiska alone. Bombardiers often had to bomb through clouds at unseen land targets. As long as there was a volcanic mountaintop as a landmark, they knew just where to drop their bombs. Many Alaska flight crews used nose art to express their opinion on the future prospects of the enemy. It might be the sting of a bee or the caricature of the difference in Japanese expression at Pearl Harbor and after the bomb crew could hit Tokyo. The Martin B-26 twin-engine bomber also made its combat debut in Alaska. In one of its earliest actions, the 77th Bomb Squadron Marauders were armed with Navy torpedoes. They pursued and found the Japanese fleet, which had attacked Dutch Harbor, but no hits were recorded. At Kiska and Altu, the Japanese had time to prepare some of the heaviest anti-aircraft defenses in the entire Pacific theater. Ambulances were scarce, so the radio cry of "wounded on board" often meant the use of whatever transport might be handy. American aircraft had to fight the weather, then run a gauntlet of very accurate anti-aircraft fire from the two islands. A lucky few planes managed to survive being hit, then fight the weather back to a base and make a safe landing. Combat in the Aleutians was often make-do, but it saved lives. Some landings were better than others. Although badly damaged by a flak burst, this B-26 brought its crew back in one piece. The aircraft was a write-off upon landing, yet another testimony to the accuracy of Japanese gunners. Despite the weather, there were always the last-minute briefings, even with the limited number of targets on the Japanese-held islands. The briefings were kept simple. The crews had done it all before. They knew which mountain peak marked which target and how long to wait before dropping their bombs. It was a rare day when the Aleutian bombers did not have to drop through the clouds. The compass and airspeed indicator were just about all the bomb sight they needed. The Navy's VP-42 and 43 operated the lumbering PBYs, sometimes adding their bombs to those of the heavies, while the Grumman J-2F Duck performed liaison and rescue duties. Just after midnight on the 11th of May, 1943, American Army Scouts landed on Altu. Some 4 hours later, the 7th Infantry Division carried out the U.S. Army's first ever amphibious landing. They expected the island would be taken in about 3 days. It took 3 weeks of bitter hand-to-hand fighting before Altu was secured. The nearly 2,400 Japanese troops had been concentrated at one end of the island. Only 28 survived the final land battle. Of the American landing force, 549 men died in combat. Over 6,000 Japanese troops had occupied Kiska and Altu. Some weeks before the Altu battle, Kiska was abandoned and the troops sent back to Japan for the defense of their homeland. The Allies then attacked Kiska Island, not knowing the Japanese had already gone, leaving behind their fortifications and heavy weapons. The land battle was over, but not before more than 300 more Allied troops were casualties against a non-existent enemy. With the end of the Aleutian Campaign and America's first theater victory of the war, the mission of the Alaska forces changed. New airfields with concrete runways were built on the island of Shemya and on Altu. The fields at Adak and Amchitka finally got concrete runways in anticipation of becoming bases for the new B-29 super bombers. Both Army and Navy aircraft were now hundreds of miles closer to the military port facilities and airfields of the northern Japanese islands. We used these Aleutian bases to take the war to Japan, literally coming in by the back door. Among the changes, 4 veteran Alaska squadrons were reassigned, the crews undoubtedly glad to put Aleutian flying behind them. Although the number of Army aircraft was reduced, bombing raids from Alaska's bases continued. The less than 20 operational Air Corps bombers left in the Aleutian Islands were augmented by Navy PV-1 patrol bombers. These bombing missions continued until the Japanese surrender in 1945. The Lockheed P-38 saw extensive use in the Aleutians, both as a fighter and for photo reconnaissance. The early F and G model Lightnings devised an innovative method for locating enemy aircraft. They would fly just above the clouds in company with a radar-equipped B-17. When the radar detected enemy aircraft, the P-38s would burst through the cloud, guns blazing. This was the technique used for the first P-38 victories of the war. The big fighters didn't always come away unscathed. Japanese pilots could be decent gunners also. Whether it was battle damage or routine maintenance, the ground crews took excellent care of their airplanes. The gun compartment always received special attention. Although the quality isn't the best, this rare film illustrates how the weapons were installed in the P-38. Lightnings were armed with a 20mm cannon and 4 50-caliber machine guns. The centralized location of the guns gave the fighters a heavy combat punch. A roomy cockpit was a blessing, especially for the long missions performed by the P-38s. Specialized photo P-38s, known as F-5s, carried camera equipment in the nose, which had been modified with windows for each camera. They captured on film all that was happening on the islands below. Only rarely did an F-5 pilot have the luxury of using a handheld 16mm camera to record some of his operations from the cockpit. The photos they brought back gave American intelligence experts an invaluable visual tool for an accurate assessment of enemy activities and movements. Operating a movie camera with one hand and flying a twin-engine fighter with the other wasn't easy. The pilot didn't have the luxury of adjusting the camera for available light. So they came to the Aleutians. Not the most glamorous of assignments, but they came. They built airfields in impossible locations under impossible conditions. Their work stood the test of time. The last military base in the Aleutians remained operational for over 50 years. The facilities are still used by civilian aircraft. If success is measured by kill numbers, the Aleutian Warbirds may appear insignificant. There were no high-scoring aces. In fact, in over 15 months of combat, all of the American and Canadian fighter pilots combined destroyed a total of only 34 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. They flew in the worst weather anywhere in the world. They were the crew chiefs, the pilots, the mechanics, and the administrators. They fought a battle that few outside Alaska even knew was going on, in an area as cold and inhospitable as any in the world. They worked hard and, when and where they could, played hard. All the while, they were stuck on a remote and uninhabited island 1,000 miles from nowhere. For over 2 years they stayed with no leave, no weekend passes, and nowhere to go. In the end, when they finally did get home, it was to indifference and ignorance. The Aleutians, where's that? Despite what some historians say, Army tanks were used in the Aleutians, often for base perimeter defense. The Aleutian Campaign was important to the U.S. victory over Japan in the Pacific Theater. Because of it, the Navy had its carriers in the right place at the right time to defeat the Japanese fleet at Midway. This forgotten campaign was the first U.S. offensive of the war. It was also the first to be won. It saw the first ever combat use of the P-38 fighter, the B-26 bomber, and the Marsden matting surface material. The U.S. Army made its first World War II amphibious combat landing in the Aleutians. From here, the first land-based bombing attacks on Japan were launched. The Navy fought its last and longest daytime surface battle. The Aleutian Campaign was also the only World War II battle fought entirely on the North American continent. Because of the Aleutian victories, the U.S. Air Force can fly the skies of today's Alaska, maintaining the freedom the Warbirds of the Aleutian Islands helped to win.